For my presentation, I chose to do the literary theories of formalism and structuralism. Formalism mainly composes of the structural purpose of a particular text. It takes a text and studies it so without taking into account any outside influences. Oftentimes, it rejects altogether what is known as brackets, or notions of culture, social influences, authorship, and content. Instead of this, formalism focuses primarily on modes, genre, discourse, and forms. Throughout literary theory, formalism refers to analyzation, interpretation, and the evaluation of the features of a text. This includes grammar, syntax, meter, and literary tropes. This approach reduces the significance that a text relies on historical, biographical, and cultural context. The rise of formalism had much to do with the rise in the 20th century as a reaction towards Romanticist thought and theories. Formalism subverted the ideals of Romanticism, where much of the text was centered on the artist and creative genius, by bringing the notion that instead the text itself should be under the spotlight, and was to show that the text itself was indebted to other works that had preceded it. Two strains of literary thought were conceived, one being Russian formalism and the other being Anglo-American New Criticism. After the Second World War, up through the 1970s, formalism was the dominant mode of academic literary study in the United States. This was especially seen in the works of René Wellick and Austin Warren's theory of literature. While it is said that formalism may be making a comeback in recent years, it was done away with in the late 1970s and displaced by various new approaches that involves the way in which students may present their writing. Formalism research is conducted by allowing the text to speak to the readers instead of cutting out unintended meaning in a written piece. These views resemble language as the true master, rather than the teacher as the master writer. Within Russian formalism, there was the Society of Poetic Language, founded in 1916 in St. Petersburg by Boris Eichenbaum, Viktor Shklovsky, and Yuri Tianovnov, as well as the Moscow Linguistics Club, which was founded in 1914 by Roman Jacobson. Eichenbaum's essay he wrote in 1926, The Theory of the Formal Method, provided an economical basis for the approach that formalists sponsored, which included some common ideas. These included: the aim is to produce a science of literature that would be both independent and factual, which is sometimes designated by the term poetics. The second, since literature is made of language, linguistics will be a foundational element of the science of literature. The next point, literature is autonomous from external conditions in the sense that literary language is distinct from ordinary uses of language, not least because it is not entirely communicative. Next, literature has its own history, a history of innovation and formal structures, and is not determined, as some crude versions of Marxism have it, by external material history. Next, what a work of literature says cannot be separated from how the literary work says it, and therefore the form and of a work, far from being merely the decorative wrapping of an isolated content, is in fact the part of the content of work. The emphasis on form was not well received at the expense of the thematic content, especially after the Russian Revolution of 1917. The chief critique of this was Leon Trotsky and his work Literature and Revolution. The other aspect of literary theory that I researched was structuralism. This concept, which refers to many different fields of study, correlates to the elements of human culture, and how it must be understood and uncovered. All the structures that underline all that things that humans do, think, feel, and perceive. The theory of structuralism arose in Europe in the early 1900s with the structural linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure. As an intellectual movement, structuralism was seen as an apparent heir to existentialism. The term structuralism first arose in the works of French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss and rose in France to be the structuralist movement, which influenced many French writers and philosophers. Structuralism connected with the work of Ferdinand de Saussure on linguistics, along with the linguistics of Prague and Moscow schools. Saussure pronounced three basic structural linguistic concepts. The first being that he argued for a distinction between langue, an idealized abstraction of language, and parole, language as used in everyday life. He argued that the sign was composed of both a signified, an abstract concept or idea, and a signifier, the perceived sound/visual. The next part was because different languages have different words to describe the same objects or concepts, there is no intrinsic reason why a specific sign or identifier is given to express a signifier. It is thus arbitrary. The next key part was that signs thus obtain their meaning from their relationships in contrast with other signs. As he wrote, in language, there are only differences without positive terms. Within literary theory, structuralist criticism relates towards literary text to a larger structure, which could be a genre, a range of intellectual connections, a model of a universal narrative structure, or a system of recurrent patterns and motifs. The argument is made that there must be a structure in every text, and it explains why it is much easier for experienced readers to interpret texts versus an inexperienced reader. It seems to state that all writings are governed by rules of grammar and literature, that one learns in educational institutions and must be unmasked. Keynotes in structural linguistics include paradigm, syntagm, and value. A structural idealism is a class of linguistics units, lexemes, morphemes, or even constructions, which are possible in a certain position in a given linguistic environment, such as a given sentence, which is called the syntagm. All of these different functional roles make up the members of the paradigm called value. Structural linguistics refer to the approach of examining the elements of language and how they relate to each other in the present synchronically rather than diachronically. Saussure argued that linguistic signs should be broken down into two parts, one being a signifier, the sound pattern of a word either in mental projection, as when one silently recites the lines from a signage, a poem to oneself, or an actual, any kind of text, physical realization as part of a speech act, or a signified, the concept of or meaning of the word. There are many criticisms towards structuralism and is mostly not used as a theory for textual analysis anymore. Critics have tried to apply this theory to individual works, but the effort to find unique structures in literary works runs counter to the structuralist program and has an affinity with new criticism. Formalism and structuralism share many key tenets and originated around the same time frame. Both of these theories go in depth into the very structure of writing as a whole and describe a formulaic way of creating new stories and in the interpretation of such. Many of the works written by Jorge Borges reflect the context of structuralism as well as formalism. One of these stories that stands out to me the most is The Alif. The story is laid out structurally different from any other like it, using a form of science and mathematics to formulate a story, which is held together by a strong sense of linguistics. But yet at the same time, the story is separated entirely from external sources, as we see a world described internally via senses. The story has its own history and is separated from that of the external real-world history. What is said in the story is the story cannot be separated with no decorated wrapping of language, but one cohesive piece of work. In The Alif, we see a very distinctive structural use of language and its intent. Many words and phrases are used, including the title itself, that may be interpreted in different ways due to words having multiple meanings and translations among languages. The language throughout the story may be broken down between the signifier and the signified, or the concepts of physical realizations of words and the actual meaning of words.